Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but after what happened, I just had to share. For context, I'm the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. We handle everything from warehouse storage to last-mile delivery, and while we've grown rapidly over the past 5 years, I started to feel like I was losing touch with the day-to-day reality of my business. I'd hear polished updates in board meetings, reports that made everything seem fine, but every so often, I'd get an email from an employee or a frustrated customer that made me wonder, was everything as good as my leadership team claimed? So, I did something drastic. I went undercover. I grew out my beard, ditched my usual suits, and had my assistant create a fake employee profile for me under a different name. With some carefully planned logistics and HR's quiet cooperation, I got hired as a new warehouse worker at one of our busiest hubs. No one knew who I really was. For a week, I was just Mike, the new guy trying to learn the ropes. Within the first hour of my first shift, I realized I had no idea what was actually happening inside my own company. For starters, the workload was brutal. I expected it to be physically demanding, but I wasn't ready for the sheer intensity of it. The moment I clocked in, I was thrown into unloading a truck without any real training. The supervisor, a guy named Ray, barked instructions at me like I should already know what I was doing. "Move faster, rookie," he snapped when I hesitated for half a second, trying to figure out where to stack the boxes. But that was nothing compared to what I saw happening around me. A guy named Luis, who'd been working there for 3 years, had to beg for a bathroom break because they were short-staffed. Another employee, a woman named Sam, had been covering shifts because a coworker got injured, but she wasn't getting overtime pay, just extra credit for her effort, whatever that meant. And then there was the safety issue. Stacks of inventory were piled dangerously high, with some leaning at angles that made me nervous. When I asked about it, Luis just shrugged and said, "Yeah, we've told management, but they just tell us to be careful." I was floored. At the corporate level, we prided ourselves on being an employee-first company. I'd sat in meetings where we talked about creating a great workplace culture. Yet here I was, in one of my own warehouses, watching employees get run into the ground, safety concerns ignored, and a manager treating people like they were disposable. And that was just day one. By the end of my shift, my back was aching, my hands were sore, and my head was spinning. This wasn't just a management issue, it was a complete disconnect between what I thought my company was and what it actually was. I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't just walk in and announce myself yet. I needed to see more, understand more. So, I decided to stay undercover for the full week. What I found next? That's when things got even worse. The next night, I returned to my shift more prepared. I had spent the entire day thinking about what I had seen. The inefficiency, the lack of motivation, the toxic leadership, it was worse than I had imagined. But I needed more information. I needed to understand how deep these problems ran before I could fix them. Daryl was already in the break room when I arrived, feet propped up on a table, scrolling through his phone. "Back for more?" he asked with a smirk. "Yep," I replied, forcing a grin. "Ready to get to work." Luis gave me a nod from across the room, but his shoulders were hunched like he was bracing for another long night. As soon as we clocked in, Daryl started assigning tasks. Once again, instead of helping, he hovered around criticizing everything we did. "You're stacking that wrong, Mike," he said after barely glancing at my work. "You want me to hold your hand?" I bit my tongue and fixed the boxes, knowing full well I had stacked them correctly. As the night dragged on, I made it a point to talk to Luis and a few of the other employees. They were hesitant at first, but little by little, they started to open up. Luis told me he had been working here for over a year and had never received a raise. "They keep saying there's no budget for it," he muttered. "But Daryl gets bonuses." That was interesting. Bonuses? I'd have to look into that. Another employee, Jasmine, confided in me that she had been passed over for promotion 3 times despite being one of the longest-serving workers on the team. "Daryl picks his favorites," she said. "And if you're not one of them, good luck." This was getting worse by the minute. Then came the moment that nearly made me break character. It was around 3 a.m. when Luis accidentally knocked over a display of cleaning supplies. The bottles clattered loudly onto the floor, rolling in every direction. Daryl stormed over instantly, his face twisted in anger. "You're a damn liability," he snarled. "Clean it up and get out of my sight." Luis scrambled to clean up the mess, but I saw his hands shaking. He looked like he was on the verge of tears. That was it. I couldn't let this go on. I took a deep breath and stepped in. "Hey, it was an accident," I said calmly. "No need to bite his head off." Daryl turned on me, eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, Mike?" I met his gaze without flinching. "Yeah, I do. This isn't leadership. This is bullying." The room went silent. Louise froze, looking between us. Even Jasmine, who had been restocking shelves, stopped what she was doing. Daryl let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't know how things work around here, newbie. Stay in your lane." I smiled slightly. "Oh, I think I know exactly how things work. And that's about to change." Daryl scoffed and walked away, but I could tell my words had rattled him. When the shift finally ended, Luis lingered behind. "Thanks," he said quietly. "No one ever stands up to him." I patted his shoulder. "That's going to change." Little did Daryl know, his days as king of the night shift were numbered. I had seen enough. Now, it was time to act. I woke up the next afternoon with a stiff back and sore arms, but my mind was sharper than ever. I had seen enough. The toxic culture, the neglect, the way employees were mistreated, it all had to change. But I knew I couldn't just walk in and fire Daryl on the spot. If I wanted to fix this, I had to understand the full scope of the problem first. So, I made some calls. First, I reached out to my assistant under the guise of Mike. I had her pull the records for employee turnover at this location. Unsurprisingly, this store had one of the highest rates in the region. Employees weren't just leaving, they were running. Next, I checked into Daryl's employment history. The bonuses Luis had mentioned? They were real. Turns out, Daryl had been getting quarterly incentives for performance improvements, but when I looked at the actual performance data, sales had been stagnant. If anything, customer complaints had risen. So what was he really improving? I had a strong feeling I knew the answer. That night, I walked into the store with a new plan. Instead of just observing, I started asking more pointed questions. I asked Luis if he had ever received formal training. "Nope," he shrugged. "Just got thrown in and told to figure it out." I asked Jasmine why she had been passed over for a promotion. Daryl said I wasn't management material. And then I did something bold. I pulled aside one of the newer hires, a kid named Marcus who had only been there for 3 weeks. I asked him how he liked the job. He hesitated. "It's fine," he said at first. But when I pressed, he sighed. "Honestly? I don't think I'll stay. No one helps you, and if you mess up, Daryl makes sure you regret it." That was it. I had enough. At 4 a.m., when the shift was winding down, I waited until most of the work was done before making my move. "Daryl," I called out. He looked up from his clipboard, barely masking his annoyance. "What?" I stepped forward. "I want to talk." He sighed dramatically. "Make it quick." I glanced around. The employees had all stopped what they were doing. Even Luis, who was stacking boxes, had frozen mid-motion. "You run this team, right?" I asked. Daryl smirked. "Obviously." "So tell me, what exactly is your job?" Daryl narrowed his eyes. "What kind of question is that?" I shrugged. "Well, I've been here for a few nights now. And from what I've seen, you don't actually help stock. You don't train new employees. You don't even seem to motivate your team. You just criticize and take breaks." His smirk disappeared. "Watch your mouth, rookie." I smiled. "Oh, I think you should watch yours." And then I pulled my phone out and hit play. I had been recording. Everything. The way he belittled Luis. The way he told Jasmine she'd never get promoted. The way he insulted Marcus for asking a question. Daryl's face went pale as his own voice filled the room. I let the recording play for a few more seconds before pausing it. "So, tell me again. What exactly is your job here?" He was speechless. Jasmine let out a quiet laugh. Luis was staring wide-eyed. Then Daryl's expression hardened. "You think you can come in here and challenge me? Who do you even think you are?" I took a deep breath. It was time. I pulled out my company ID and flipped it open. "I'm your boss," I said, my voice calm but firm. and you're fired." For the first time since I met him, Daryl had nothing to say. The room was silent. Then Louise let out a small, incredulous laugh. Jasmine covered her mouth, eyes wide. Marcus whispered, "No way." Daryl took a step back. "Wait, what?" "You heard me," I said. "I own this company. I came here because I wanted to see what was really happening in my stores. And thanks to you, I got my answer." He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "You've spent years making this place miserable for the people who actually do the work. That ends now. Get your things and leave." For a moment, I thought he was going to fight back. But then he saw the looks on everyone's faces. He realized there was no saving himself. With a muttered curse, he stormed toward the break room, slamming the door behind him. I turned back to the employees, who were still frozen in shock. "Luis," I said, "how would you feel about helping train new hires?" His eyes widened. "Wait, seriously?" I nodded. "You've been here long enough to know how things should run. And I think it's time we start promoting people based on merit, not favoritism." Jasmine shook her head in disbelief. "I still can't believe that just happened." I smiled. "Believe it. Things are going to change." And with that, my undercover mission was over. But the real work was just beginning. Daryl was gone, but his absence didn't magically fix everything. The store was still a mess, low morale, inefficient processes, and a staff that had grown used to being ignored or reprimanded instead of supported. The first night after firing him, I walked into the break room, and the usual idle chatter stopped. Everyone looked at me, waiting. Some were skeptical, some were just confused. They didn't know what to expect now. I sat down, leaning forward. "All right, let's talk," I said, looking around. There was a pause before Jasmine folded her arms and asked, "About what?" I shrugged. "Everything. What's wrong here? What's working? What's not? I want to hear it all." The room stayed silent for a second, but then Luis laughed under his breath. "Wait, you actually want to know?" I nodded. "That's why I'm here." That was all it took. The floodgates opened. Luis was the first to speak up, frustrated that we were always understaffed, leaving people burned out and falling behind. Jasmine jumped in next, shaking her head as she explained how broken the inventory system was. Half the products weren't logged correctly, and no one communicated between shifts, making everything twice as hard as it needed to be. Marcus, one of the newer hires, told me the training was a joke. There was no real process, just getting thrown into the job and hoping you didn't mess up badly enough to get yelled at. I sat there, listening, taking notes, letting them get it all out. Some of it I had suspected, but hearing it directly from them made it hit differently. When they finally stopped, I looked around and said, "Okay, let's start fixing this." Jasmine raised an eyebrow at me. "Like now?" she asked, half skeptical, half intrigued. I nodded. "Right now. We're not waiting for some corporate meeting. We start small, we test things out, and we make this a place where people actually want to work." I made a call to HR before the shift even started, getting approval for more hours so we could finally have enough people scheduled. Then, instead of blindly trusting the broken inventory system, I asked Luis to walk me through it firsthand. The reality was worse than I had imagined: outdated software, handwritten lists that were never double-checked, and miscommunications that led to lost stock and wasted time. When I suggested we do a full inventory check right then and there, Luis looked at me like I was crazy. "That's gonna take forever." Jasmine let out a short laugh. "I hope you realize how much work this is." I grinned. "Which is why I'm doing it with you." That changed the energy in the room. They had never seen someone from corporate, let alone the CEO, actually working beside them. At first, they were hesitant, but as the night went on, things started shifting. The silence that usually filled the store turned into casual conversation. Luis joked about my terrible handwriting as I struggled to mark down stock. Marcus, still new, asked me how I had even ended up running a company in the first place. Even Jasmine, the most skeptical, admitted that it felt good to actually be listened to. Not everyone was convinced, though. Some of the older employees kept their distance, watching but not engaging. One of them muttered, "Corporate always comes in, makes a bunch of promises, and then disappears. We've seen it before." I didn't argue. I didn't give a big speech about how this time was different. I just kept working. By the end of the shift, we had done our first full inventory check in months. The stockroom was reorganized, making it easier to find things. More importantly, for the first time in a long time, people actually worked together like a team. When we clocked out, Jasmine shook her head. I still don't know if this is real. I smiled at her. It's real. And it's just the beginning. The next night, I walked into the store and immediately felt a difference. It wasn't some dramatic shift, but the energy was lighter. Employees weren't dragging themselves through the shift like it was a punishment. They were moving with a little more purpose, a little more ease. Luis greeted me with a nod instead of the wary glance he used to give Daryl. Even Jasmine, still cautious, didn't seem as closed off. But I knew better than to assume a single good night meant the problem was solved. There was still tension in the air, especially from the veteran employees who had seen too many empty promises. Some of them had been working here for years, dealing with poor management, getting overlooked, and watching people like Daryl fail upward. They weren't about to trust that I was any different just because I had spent a couple of nights lifting boxes with them. So I kept going. The first priority was setting up a new training process. If new hires were just being thrown onto the floor and expected to figure things out on their own, that had to change. I pulled Luis aside before our shift started and asked him how he would train someone if he had the chance. He hesitated at first, probably thinking it was a trap, but then he started talking. He had been doing this job for over a year, and he knew exactly where people struggled, how they fumbled with the scanners, how no one ever showed them the easiest way to stack boxes, how they got overwhelmed by the backstock layout. You should be the one training new hires, I told him. His eyes widened. Me? Why not? I asked. You know this job better than anyone, and you actually care about doing it right. He still looked skeptical, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, pride. No one had ever acknowledged that before. Jasmine, on the other hand, was tougher to convince. She had been here the longest, and she had watched guys like Daryl walk all over people while she got ignored. She was good at her job, but she had been overlooked so many times that she stopped trying to prove herself. I found her in the break room during lunch and asked her why she had never applied for a supervisor role. She scoffed. What's the point? It's not like they'd actually pick me. Well, I said, they didn't before. But they will now. She frowned. You can't just decide that. I leaned against the table. Why not? Daryl got his position because he was loud and aggressive, not because he was a good leader. You actually know how to do the job, and people respect you. That's what we need. She stared at me for a moment, like she was trying to figure out if I was messing with her. Then she let out a small laugh. I'll believe it when I see it. Fair enough. I had to prove it. That night, we kept working. I saw the changes happening, slow but steady. Luis was stepping up, guiding newer employees instead of just suffering through the night in silence. Jasmine started speaking up more, correcting small mistakes and helping people stay organized. Even Marcus, who had barely spoken when he first started, seemed more confident. But not everyone was on board. One of the older employees, a guy named Rick, had been working there for 5 years. He had seen multiple managers come and go, and he wasn't shy about his opinions. I caught him shaking his head as he watched Luis helping a newer hire organize the backstock. This is cute, Rick muttered as I walked past. I stopped. What is? This whole thing. You playing boss, acting like things are gonna change. He leaned against the shelf, arms crossed. You'll be gone soon, and it'll go back to the way it always does. I looked at him for a second, then nodded. You might be right. He blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. This won't stick unless the right people step up, I continued. So the question is, are you going to help fix it, or are you just going to sit back and wait for it to fail? Rick didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, then let out a sigh and turned back to his work. But later that night, I caught him quietly fixing a shelf that someone had stacked incorrectly. He didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. Change wasn't going to happen overnight. Some people needed time to believe in it. But I could already see it starting, and I wasn't going anywhere until I made sure it lasted. The store was changing, but I knew the real test would come when I stepped away. It's easy to make an impact when you're physically present, working alongside people, showing them you care. But what happens when you're gone? Would things stick, or would they slide back into the old ways? I had spent a week undercover, and in that time, I saw everything I needed to see, both the problems and the potential. Louise had stepped up as an informal leader, guiding newer employees. Jasmine, despite her skepticism, was proving she had what it took to be in charge. Even Rick, who had been convinced nothing would change, was starting to take quiet ownership of the store's operations. But if I really wanted this to last, I had to make my move. On my last night, I called a meeting at the start of the shift. Normally, these employees never got to hear from corporate, let alone the CEO. They only got decisions handed down to them without explanation. But that wasn't how I wanted to run this company anymore. I stood in front of them, no longer Mike the new hire, but as their actual boss. Some of them still couldn't believe it. Marcus kept staring at me like I had just revealed I was an alien. Luis was shifting on his feet, waiting to hear what would happen next. Jasmine was watching me with her arms crossed, as if daring me to prove that this wasn't just another empty promise. I came here to see things for myself, I started. Because I knew something wasn't right, and I didn't want to rely on reports or secondhand information. I wanted the truth. And now that I've seen it, I can tell you this, things are going to change. For real this time. There were no cheers, no immediate applause. Just silence as they waited. First, I continued, we're promoting from within. No more playing favorites or ignoring people who deserve opportunities. Luis, you're officially the new training lead. His eyes widened. Wait, what? I smiled. You're already doing the job. Now you'll actually get paid for it. He looked around, half expecting someone to tell him it was a joke. But when Jasmine clapped him on the shoulder, his face broke into a huge grin. I turned to her next. Jasmine, you've been overlooked for too long. That ends now. If you want it, the assistant manager position is yours. She blinked, caught off guard for the first time since I met her. Are you serious? Completely. She exhaled and shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. All right. Let's do it. I nodded and turned to the rest of the team. I know some of you are still skeptical. I don't blame you. You've seen bad managers come and go, and you've been left to pick up the pieces. But here's my promise to you, I'm not just fixing this store. I'm fixing this company. And it starts with treating the people who do the real work with the respect they deserve. This time, I saw it, the shift in the room. It wasn't just words anymore. It was real. As the meeting wrapped up, employees lingered instead of rushing off. Luis was still in shock, talking excitedly with Marcus about training ideas. Jasmine, true to form, was already planning out what she wanted to change. Even Rick gave me a small nod on his way back to work, which from him, was basically a standing ovation. I left that night knowing one thing for certain, the company I thought I was running wasn't the company that actually existed. But now it could be. The next morning, I sent out a memo to my leadership team. Subject, new direction. Effective immediately. I wasn't just fixing one store. I was rebuilding everything. And this was only the beginning.